operators and logistics professionals, we have a significant role as a sector to play in understanding the climate challenge and connecting the dots, because we get to actually set the standards. And I was quite inspired by our last session, which was the first session that we did, in the kind of interest and questions that came about, all of this is fine and this wonderful story about climate, but what do we do? And so I reached out to Center for Energy, Environment and Water, which is truly, really the leading light in the area of energy, environment and water research in the country and policy. They were talking about this climate science, the mitigation of it, pathways for it, risk reduction, policy around it, including India's Solar Alliance, at a time when many people were not even talking about it. And so I thought that instead of, we going to anybody else, we need to go to a homegrown institution that understands India, understands climate, and understands the mitigation that that comes along with it. There are three amazing colleagues from CEW who are joining us today: Harsimran Kaur, Abhinav Soman, and Himani Jain. Both Abhinav and Himani, who are going to be presenters for today, have spent significant amount of time researching, publishing, and coordinating this. They also have a significant experience in working with industry-led coalitions as well as issues. And there's a lot of work, Harsimran, that I know you've also been involved in around electric mobility. And so we really have the CAT team here. As people join, since in the interest of time, I know Abhinav and Himani, you have a fantastic presentation. So I want us to get started, and I'm sure as people keep joining, Vasant, we can, you are anyway recording this session, so you could share with the members who may have been a little late.
Absolutely.
So over to you guys, Himani and Abhinav, and thank you very, very much for doing this and coming on board to help us navigate this very important but difficult journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhairavi. Thank you so much for this opportunity to AMTOI and also to all the eminent members who are present here. I hope I'm audible and clear.
Yes, very much.
Yes. Thank you. So very quickly, it's a great opportunity to be here, to be amongst all of you who are really the change makers, who can be the change makers, who need to be the change makers, as Bhairavi has already highlighted. I'll just take 2 minutes to a bit introduce Council on Energy, Environment and Water. It is one of the Asia's leading not-for-profit research think tanks. Research institutions. The council uses data integrated analysis and strategic outreach to basically explain and change the use, reuse, and misuse of resources. We are already a 10-year-old organization. We have celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. We are about 100 plus sort of very dedicated researchers, niche researchers, action policy researchers. We are led by Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who's the founder and the CEO of the organization. In our last 10 years of operations, actually Council has engaged in like 300 plus research projects. Most of them, 99% of them, have been peer reviewed, published in public domain, for everybody to access that kind of evidence in data and analytics. But also we are very proud of having created about 100 plus, new databases or improved access to data. So for us, everything is evidence-based, everything is sort of driven like that. We work across 7 key vertical areas, as you can see here: energy access, renewables, power sector and all. And we have a separate 8th dedicated center for energy finance, where the focus is on improving the market, basically getting in the market functioning and getting in the functions to make it more green, more sustainable, so the technologies can be updated. We are part of the TFT team, Technology, Finance and Trade, and our team is Sustainable Mobility. We do have a, sorry. So we do work across different teams.
Excuse me, can I ask someone to just mute themselves, please?
So we do work across a range of topics, and from solar adoption, renewable energy, green hydrogen, climate policy. We also work with emerging economies: Indonesia, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. We have a larger footprint. In India, of course, we have a very, very decent footprint. We have active workings with 21 states. Just to set the context for this particular discussion, I would just like to highlight that the aspects that we hope to cover, talk about, discuss in today's, session are more about, as an overview, what is the overall ecosystem of greenhouse gases, of abatement, of emission abatement. What does it mean, to do all those things? What does it mean for industries? What is in it for them to gain? What are their benefits? What are their direct benefits? What are the things that they can initiate as a chain, in the ecosystem? What are some of the initial steps that are absolutely necessary? We will be introducing those initial steps. We would like to hear, also from you. It's not a monologue that we want to engage in. We will stop at different points, and we would like to hear what are your experiences, what are the challenges that you're facing. And then we want to say that there are different set of organizations. They are at different level of advancement in this conversation. So in this emission reduction conversation, there are some who are considering it. There are new businesses. There are older businesses who are well established. Now they're at the path of expansion. So the challenges for each organization are different. And hence the solutions are also different. Each one has to have a different solution and their different strategy of what they want to do now, or what they want to do in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So it is not a sort of a fixed formula for everybody. So hence these conversations are important, and we want to talk about what it means when you have achieved one level. What is the next level where you should go? Once you have achieved that next level, what is the further next level where you can go, and how the benefits and monetization can also happen over time? So this is sort of the broader conversation that we want to get engaged in. I don't want to sort of talk too much around the general stuff, but we all know how greenhouse gas effect is important, how it is important at a certain level where it helps keep a certain, warmth in the Earth's atmosphere, without which it would have been very cold. But then overdoing of it is happening. This greenhouse gas effect is increasing. This greenhouse effect is increasing, because of which the temperature is increasing. There are particular gases. We will list and talk about those gases a bit later, but certain gases enhance that process. These are the greenhouse gases. This process is enhanced with burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, different fuels. Even with agriculture, land clearing, removing the forests, because of certain industrial processes. Because of these, when the concentration of greenhouse gas increases, because of this enhanced greenhouse effect, there is a contribution to the warming of the earth. Now, when we talk about the warming of the earth, we are essentially not talking about small temperatures or small heat changes. We are basically talking about tremendous gradual increase of temperature. So there are global oceans. Those oceans have enough capacity to take in that kind of a heat, but that continuous heat addition will, on an average, if 2 degrees will be changed, in that global surface temperature, what it means. So on the next slide, you can see that since 1880s, when you monitor this kind of change in temperature until 2020, you can see that we have already risen by about 1.2 degrees. And when I say that, that's against the average baseline, which you can see as 0.0. There is continuous increase in the carbon dioxide emissions, and those temperatures, though have been
abruptly higher in the last few years. A lot has been absorbed by the oceans, but the gradual temperature change is intensifying. And we can feel it. We relate with it. Every day when there are temperature extremes, even in any part of India, when there are reducing snow covers, when there are sea ice, when there are heavy rainfalls in certain areas, when there are droughts, when there are floods, everybody relates with it. And uh, so these are the basic areas, and that is why we are trying to talk about a change. In the next slide, you can see that there are certain gases which are absolutely important to talk about, and we concentrate on these ones. So from carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these are the key ones. And you can see the GWP. GWP is a very simple sort of comparative measure to say, in comparison to carbon dioxide, what is the warming potential that that particular gas has. So carbon dioxide, if you add, okay, it adds this much of temperature effect. But methane, for example, will be 28 times more warming. Nitrous oxide will be like 250 times more warming. So these are the way the problem increases. Then you have a complete set of hydrofluorocarbons. Now you have a NF3 also added in the conversation. But without getting in sort of too much of details of these, what is essential and important for us to understand is that where is it coming from and why we need to focus on these gases. It's in the simplistic term, carbon dioxide is a bigger problem. It constitutes about 2/3 of the problem. Others are slightly smaller. But when you start looking at the sector, transportation alone sort of causes about 15% of this problem. So as a sector, as a transportation or mobility sector, while we are essential as a lifeline for the economic systems, for people's mobility, for goods mobility, there are still a sort of carbon footprint that we leave behind. We are responsible for it, and there are a lot of things that can be done to turn around this situation. So going further, even within the freight, even within the transport, there are certain segments which contribute far more, just because of the far more, vehicle kilometers. So road passenger as well as road freight, basically because of the larger vehicle kilometers contribute much more. About 75% of the problem comes from the road, while aviation, shipping, aviation is a major contributing sector, especially with regards to the trips and the vehicle kilometers that it does. Shipping, rail, and others, you will find, despite doing so many more kilometers, are much more sustainable. So this is a sort of reference that has to sort of set within us. Going further, I just want to make one point, that when we talk about the emission intensity, you can see very simply in the air transport, the above graph, that the numbers are starting from 450 equivalent carbon dioxide grams per kilometer, while the conversation in the road transportation starts from 50 grams carbon dioxide equivalent per kilometer. And this is for even like heavy duty vehicles. It is much worse, for smaller vehicles, the sort of operation they do, the sort of conditions in which they operate, frequent congestions, stop and go, all of those are contributing factors. On a highway, when you go on a smooth speed, in a sort of more congestion-free environment, that's where the gains are. But the scale is so different. So it is equally important for us to see how much of air transport can be avoided, how efficient it can be, how green it can be, but at the same time, look at the road transport, because the vehicle kilometers are far more and the overall quantum of impact is much more. In the next slide, just for quick reference, we don't really want to get in the details here, but these are inland waterways, sea transport, and rail. You will find that the footprint is much lower. The units are starting from 2, 3, 4, 5. These are single number digits from where the impact starts. So these are not in terms of per kilometer carbon dioxide contribution or carbon dioxide equivalent contribution. These are the modes which are already very sustainable, already very green. and further greening can happen for railways, with electrification. Further greening for sea transport and inland waterways is already, for sea transport is being pushed by IMO. So all those conversations that we will have in the sort of next few slides. Going further, just to sort of set everything in a global policy context and what it means for us, how India is sort of playing it out in this global carbon and climate change negotiations. So the whole, thing formalized and got into being in 1992 with UNFCCC, when this whole thing was signed at Rio. And then subsequently, 5 years later, Kyoto Protocol had come into effect. But India ratified it much later. So it took us another 5 years to, be part of it and get into the ratification with Kyoto Protocol. But another 5 years later, 6 years later, in 2008, that's when India had a very sort of coherent, multi-sectoral sort of policy, vision across different sectors for climate impact. So the take which, the conversation or the tone for the India up till now had been that I am a developing country, there is much more that you need to do, and I'm still growing, I have those priorities, but at the same time I will try to be sustainable, I will try to be green. That's the sort of conversation that India had maintained up till now, but it is fast undergoing a larger change with the new government taking a bit of further stand. We are no longer sort of calling ourselves, underdeveloped or developing country. We sort of try and take and be responsible and accountable for our own, GHG footprint. The conversation has further changed to say we will voluntarily announce cuts. Now COP26 is going to happen in November, and that's where further responsibility, accountability, further voluntary emission reductions commitments are expected out of India. We are the largest democracy in the world, and we have large populations, though per population footprint is small, but we do want to, be one of the leaders in the conversation. So when we talk about these missions, solar mission, enhanced energy efficiency mission, and, certain other missions, you will notice that, certain energy efficiency, mandates that came out from BEE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Those were applicable to the transport sector. Then there are FAME schemes under these for electrification of vehicles. So there are several things which have come as programs, as schemes which required funding, which brought in funding, for increasing our initiatives in greening and making the sectors more sustainable. So in this whole background, while the international pressure is intensifying, while India also has a growing interest in becoming sustainable, and not just for 2-degree change, but also for our own economy, everything has a sort of a multiple effect. Becoming, increasing our penetration of renewable energy does not have an effect just in terms of emission reductions, but it also means a lot more in terms of energy security, the lesser fuels that we need to import, the lesser emissions, air pollution, the health related problems. So it's a multiple effect. So greening is just not everything is related to the climate change. There are sort of multiple impacts, and while it requires efforts, while it requires a certain bit of investments and initiatives in the beginning, these are large paying products in the efforts in the longer term, which means there are larger gains, and a lot of it can also be monetized. It's not that everything, and there are a huge amount of funds which are available that can be tapped into with these kind of initiatives. So my colleague Abhinav Soman will basically take over from here, and we really request that if you have questions, we will pause in between. But if you have questions, please keep putting them in the chat. That will also help us to align and know, when to take a break if there are more questions. Abhinav, over to you.
Thanks, Himani. So I'll move on to the industry imperatives when thinking about the GHG emission reduction. Why is it that it is relevant to pretty much any participant in the economy, not just for specific sectors or specific industries? So to begin with, Himani's already introduced the COP Kyoto Protocol, for instance, and the Paris Agreement that happened in 2015. This is really the global governance framework that's driving climate action among countries, among regions in the world. And so one of the main risks is that there could be regulations and laws introduced, particularly to curb emissions from virtually any sector. And it is difficult to predict at what time these will be introduced. And when not, if the industry or the particular organization is not already prepared to comply with it, it can result in additional penalties or costs in their products. So that is one of the regulatory risks, and I will talk about a specific example of this in the forthcoming slides. The other bit is about the supply chain costs and reliability. So even if in the value chain of a particular economic activity, it could be, say, car manufacturing, the car manufacturer may not be contributing much to the emissions, overall emissions. But it's possible that other suppliers, the tier one suppliers who supply the components needed for auto manufacturing, their emissions are on the higher side, and therefore the product that you're selling in the market ends up being a very GHG intensive product. So the idea with the GHG tracking is also to understand where do those hotspots lie, and so that you understand where the burden falls as well. The other bit is about the demand for various products and technology. So with increasing awareness among consumers, there's also going to be a preference for certain kinds of technology which are low carbon. Now, we know that the world is moving in a certain direction. We know, given that all of these global agreements are in place, there's a sustainable development goals that is in place, and a whole range of sort of international agreements that kind of move the economies around the world in a particular direction. And so that is generating awareness among participants in the economy as well as among consumers who prefer certain kinds of products which have the least environmental footprint. So in order to stay competitive, again, it's important to factor in some of the GHG and other impacts. The other is, of course, litigation when found to be not complying with a certain regulation. And there are, of course, reputational risks. Now, a small, and this is also part of the awareness, which is that when it comes to even attracting talent, it's increasingly people prefer to work for companies that do good for the society. So companies that may be paying the same, but are either contributing in a positive way to the environment and protecting the environment are preferred by candidates, top-notch candidates. So that's another sort of effect of the whole global shift towards accounting for emissions. But it's not just about risks. There are actually a whole range of opportunities that opens up with when you start accounting for greenhouse emissions and other environmental impacts. So one very sort of straightforward gain is that to reduce GHG, you often have to reduce the energy demand, and reducing the energy demand essentially results in cost savings for you. So taking the example of an electric vehicle user, the vehicle itself tends to be more expensive upfront, at least initially and in the beginning of the EV sort of manufacturing stage, as it is still nascent. But as the usage part of it, the fuel costs associated with using an EV are quite are quite competitive compared to a petrol and diesel vehicle. So these are typically the gains from any energy saving technology. The other bit is that this is also a nudge towards innovation, because now suddenly organizations have to rethink their processes, rethink their product lines, and think of how can they create new offerings for their customers or new services for their customers. And so this is really a time to stop and rethink what new offerings can be made, and, and can in that way drive innovation as well. The other bit is, and this is on the flip side, right? So if you have products that are less carbon intensive, then there is going to be preference for such kind of products and services. Increasingly, a lot of companies have also started labeling some of their products based on the exact footprint. And at least for maybe some small segment of consumers, that's important, and they tend to change their preferences accordingly. But moving forward, I think increasingly this will become a more common phenomenon, and more people will start demanding products of this sort. The other bit, and this could be shareholders as well, demanding that emissions reductions take place. The other bit is improving relations with stakeholders, including policymakers, civil society organizations. Every industry organization is part of it has relations with other stakeholders and has to maintain those relations. And this is really an opportunity when you're performing well on the environmental front to improve relations with these different entities. And it can also be a differentiating factor for companies. So a lot of companies have announced that they are going to, so for instance, Apple, Google, I mean, these are major companies, but they announce that they're going to have their servers run completely on renewable energy and so on. So this becomes a differentiating factor for either the company as a whole or for a particular product line. So the most critical point in this in this journey towards emission reductions is to start with an emissions inventory. You can only reduce what you can track, or you can only sort of manage what you can track. So GHG inventory is basically a greenhouse emissions inventory. There is a particular protocol for this, which is maintained by an organization, the GHG protocol. And they basically have a standardized format for assessing emissions from various activities in a particular organization and recording it and reporting it. And what this gives you doing this exercise is that it gives a common lingua franca with which you can communicate to, say, suppliers, if you find that suppliers are actually the ones who are emitting more in the entire value chain. And also with other, perhaps with policymakers when it comes to complying with some regulation. And it can also be just to enhance sort of reporting as part of, shareholder requirements, or in terms of some sort of financial reporting requirements, which can then help you increase investments towards green activities. So GHG emission inventory is essentially the starting point for all this, and it forms the base with which all kinds of communications are made, both nationally as well as internationally. And there are several mechanisms that various countries, as well as global instruments that are in place to help economies decarbonize, and also certain specific sectors decarbonize. So we're just, what we've done is we've sort of collated the broad categories here, and we'll go into some specific examples as well. So the first and foremost is, as I've mentioned, the GHG inventory, under which you have 3 different scopes, which I'll talk about in a bit. And the next level is when we get into what are the ways in which, once you've tracked your emissions, once you've quantified it, and you need to then get it certified by a third party. Once it's certified, you can these can be traded. So these there will always be certain leaders and laggards when it comes to emissions, and the market mechanisms essentially create a flexibility for the leaders to trade their excess emission reductions to a laggard, and that way the goal of maintaining emissions within a certain limit is maintained, And at the same time, there's flexibility for participants to exchange credits, carbon credits in the process. And there are a variety of disclosure mechanisms as well. There's a climate finance related disclosure, there's a carbon disclosure project, and also getting enlisted in some of the indexes that focus on sustainability. It gives a very, this sort of indicates to various investors that I am part of a transparent process that records emissions and tracks emissions. And if you're considering investing, say, for instance, via green bonds or any such mechanism, then this is really the documentation for it to prove that emission reductions have been made. If we are to then go beyond GHG emissions, we would look at what is called circular economy, where we are tracking impact not just on GHG emissions, but also or on energy consumption, but also on other non-renewable resources perhaps. And it could be water, it could be materials and minerals, for instance. It could also be the land footprint. The goal here being that we want to have uh, a kind of a process where we are recycling and reusing most of the materials, and also sending the minimum amount of waste to landfills. So that's kind of the broader goal, but it requires everybody in the value chain to follow, to adhere to certain principles, which we'll again introduce a little later. So
So,
I think, yeah.
Abhinav, sorry, I would just like to add in a bit more in the previous slide. And also, to highlight that um, at various times, the motive of taking an initiative can vary. So, of course, the basic step to taking an initiative or making an intervention is to first have a very solid inventory to know and measure exactly what is the current situation and what is the level of emissions that are happening. As Abhinav has already highlighted, that's the step one. But further to that, depending on what sort of organization is, suppose it's a small organization, a new organization, a asset heavy organization, a non asset based organization. They can be different type of organization in different type of operations and services that are being provided over the value chain. But here again, there is a, in the step two, as you can see, there are various ways in which company can take initiative. It can just be a initiative at the corporate level. It can just be a vision or mission. And I decide that voluntary, today my emissions are at this level, let's say from my ground transport, from my trucks, and I would like to reduce them by this much by this year. So it's a company specific corporate level or internal decision that we have taken, and that's my mission or that's my vision. Based on that, whichever way I want to track, there are definitely robust methodologies that are available in the system that we will talk about, but there can be internal ones as well that one can follow, and those are purely voluntary reductions that you can showcase, that you can put on your website. You can be transparent to the level you want to be. you know you can add a bit of more rigor to it, present your methodology and your numbers, and put proof on your websites. And those are the ones that become a bit more robust. They can be called science based targeted initiatives, and those can be measured. And the overall contribution, when we look at the global level or at the India level, then we will be able to take that into account to say, this company, however big or small, because enough proof was available, I can still safely assume that this much of emission reduction contribution at the regional, state, or country or global level can be accounted for. But again, why stop here? When you can build a better methodology, when you can get it verified, when you can get a more rigorous check on it, you can definitely monetize it. And I think this is the place where we would really like to highlight that it's not something that when you are making the efforts, there are support which is available.
The supports are available in terms of soft loans. The supports are available in terms of green finances. There are different things that, we will further talk about in this conversation, which are very important to understand that it's just not my efforts and costs that are building up in the name of environment. There are certain things that will definitely directly help company and the corporate in saving money. So energy efficiency, shifts, fuel reductions, energy reductions, as Abhinav has already sort of said. But suppose there are certain initiatives which are environment friendly but are not directly benefiting to me. There are different type of funds, loans, soft loans, green fundings, investors, financial institutions which are there to support those initiatives. But there are sort of catch there. So one has to have emission reduction plan. One has to have a strategy. One needs to be transparent. One needs to disclose those information in a transparent way. That's where this whole disclosures vertical work. So monetization disclosures are again both things which are benefiting to us for the things which do not seem to be directly benefiting. you know that's where I think the interest, the need for different organizations to also get engaged in. So one of the small question which I see here, that some of the non-asset based companies, how can they contribute? So no company is small or big, no effort is small or big. So these non-asset based companies are basically are clients are reaching out to them for their expertise, for the flexibility, for the more contextualized, more customized solutions. And these companies are basically connecting the dots with other companies and then providing those services. So can such a non-asset based company offer two solutions to the client, saying this one is less cost, less expensive, but it has, X amount of emissions associated with it? While if you choose the other set of service providers, so Y, Z and other service providers, there is lesser amount of emissions associated with it. Ultimately, when the ecosystem and the market changes, there have to be awareness, there have to be costs, there have to be other aspects which are related to making choices in choosing the suppliers, in choosing the services, in choosing the warehouses, in choosing the transportation entities, in choosing the vehicles. And that's where each and every contribution will start becoming will start contributing. So just another question here, and I quickly want to take that one as well. No, there are no particular costs that one needs to contribute to get involved. For example, as Abhinav will talk about in the next few slides, that making GHG inventory is something for which the companies have all the data, all the information available in-house. But that information needs to be collated and processed, and some very basic analysis needs to be done to understand what is my footprint, what are my carbon footprints, what are my other emissions footprint. So when Abhinav, when you're talking about scope 1 to estimations, do talk about that, how it's an internal company affair and they can do it almost without cost.
Yeah, thank you. So moving on to the how of it, right? How is it that we go about doing the GHG emission? And I think like if there's one takeaway slide, that would be this in terms of understanding the whole process of it. So there are, when creating a GHG inventory, there are essentially three kinds or three categories of it. What we call as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Now, for the vast majority of companies and organizations, especially when doing it for the first time, what's important are the scope 1 emissions. And the way these are defined are, these are GHG emissions occurring as from assets or operations that are directly owned or operated by a particular company. So, and it's usually occurring at site. So this could be, for instance, a factory. that uses energy for a variety of different needs for manufacturing or for any other processes. And there is combustion, and therefore there is emissions of all these different GHGs that are listed at the top, the carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, and so on. And they all essentially contribute to global warming. But the other bit is also maybe the factory also has a logistics fleet that is used for transporting something. And in this case, the site of operation is when it's on the road, right? It's not necessarily at the same location, but it's still going to and fro, and that's where the emissions are happening. Here, an important point to note is that in scope 1, the purchased electricity related emissions are not accounted for. And the reason is simple. When at the point of consumption of electricity, there is no emission taking place. The emissions happen at the thermal power plant when it is produced, right? So that is the reason that we don't account for electricity. But if the situation is such that maybe there's some sort of captive generation, then that would be accounted for. If there's a diesel generator, and if that is sort of producing electricity, there's certainly emissions that are happening on the site, and that would be accounted for. So that's really scope 1. Whatever is under the purview of a company, whatever is under the control and is directly related to its operations. What you have in the next stage, which is scope 2, is electricity, purchased energy related costs. So you are only consuming it, but there's no emission taking place. So this is a mechanism to account for. Usually, virtually every organization will have electricity consumption, and will have that will be a significant contributor to energy demand as well. And so scope 2 allows you to account for that. And the reason these are separated is so that there is no double counting that takes place, because there could be a different organization or different DISCOM could be treated as this utility company can be treated as a separate company. And so we don't want double counting to take place, and that's why it's called scope 2. When you get into scope 3, you're essentially going across the value chain. You are looking at who are my suppliers, what are their emissions, where are they sourcing their materials from, and what is the emission associated with that, and so on and so forth. So you're going both upstream and downstream. So for instance, upstream could be the petrol used in the logistics fleet is being extracted, right? And there are emissions associated with extracting extracting petroleum and then distilling that into the diesel and petrol that we tend to use. But also there are emissions associated with transporting that fuel, transporting the fuel to the petrol pump. So this is really the total emissions for that particular fuel. But let's say, again, taking a car manufacturer as an example, the tier 1 component supplier might have certain emissions associated with their own manufacturing, but also they are acquiring metals and steel from another industry. And so what are the emissions associated with extracting metal from the ore and so on. So scope 3 is really going all the way, what is called cradle to grave, just looking at the entire value chain. And downstream is also a part of it. So for instance, again, with cars, when people use the cars, there's emissions associated with burning of fuel. And also when it is disposed and when it becomes a waste and it's scrapped, there are certain, again, emissions associated with that. So the scope 3 emission of a car manufacturer would include a purview on all of these activities and the sum total of all these activities. But as far as reporting is concerned, and as far as some of the mechanisms that we talk about are concerned, it's largely about scope 1 emissions, because that is what is under the control of my operations, my manufacturing activity, my services. And what can I do about it is the real important question. Here, I'll just ask Bhairavi to come in to sort of moderate in case there are any questions. And I'd also like to hear from some of the participants about what they think are their scope 1 emissions and maybe scope 3 emissions. Yeah. Over to you.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Abhinav. So, this is a good place to just stop to see. This is a lot of terminology, and see, Abhinav, a lot of it, the questions that we have in our head is because most people in this sector, especially multimodal operation, and people who may be on this call are asset light. And so the question really comes that how does an asset light organization sort of, how does the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 really affect? And so I'll just stop here, but I'll just see if anybody who has been here has any questions. I see something from Vasant onto the chat, but I'm not seeing any other questions on the chat. So if there are any questions at this stage in sort of getting a better understanding of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, because henceforth what we will do in the presentation is really looking at how to use this scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 in some of the areas in the logistics sector. So anyone, any questions at this stage, or we can continue? Okay, so Shankar Shinde has a question. Shankar, you want to unmute and ask yourself?
Yeah.
Shankar, we're not able to hear you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible now.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Bhairavi. It's nice to hear the speakers, also eminent speakers and well deep knowledge with all these emissions. We have been hearing a lot and also reading a lot. And I think so if you see internationally it is talked, and also there is a particular format in which they describe this green logistics and how the green points can be earned in this logistics, emission points, they have the system, and through which they pass on the benefits in monetary terms, or it can be into the license terms or something in that fashion. Like, how do we foresee this in implementation? Because what I read a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years, one of the write-up was like, when you transport or when you shift over transportation by road to rail, there is an emission earning. Then from rail to by ocean, so there is more emission earning. So this type of some study which would be there, which can be presented to the government, and which can really say, okay, if I'm transporting by road, it is possible to shift over to the rail, this transportation, and that gives me emission earning of points so and so. Or where if I'm shifting from rail to coastal or the ocean transportation, this is what I would be earning the truck. So this type of a model can be formulated to present it to the government, where we can have in the form of monetary, not in directly monetary form, but even the licensing form or something of that sort, some proposal. How would we work out, and how would we formulate in our industry, like green logistics or whatever so jargon you may call it?
Sure. So I'll take a stab at that and also invite Himani to come in for comments. So I think this is like a very pertinent question to ask. The reason being that with the whole GHG accounting process, one of the key imperatives is to prove what is called additionality. So you spoke about how shifting from road to rail would reduce emissions, right? So the whole idea with the accounting protocols is to just prove that this wouldn't have happened without a certain investment made by a particular logistics company. This was not the normal trajectory of events. It's only because an initiative was taken by a particular entity that this emission reduction took place. So that's what we call additionality. So for instance, I can give another example of afforestation. There's a certain amount of trees and forests that we have in our country. And if not for investments in protecting those forests or in growing them further, there wouldn't be additional carbon reductions taking place. And the reason why there is a lot of tracking and there's a lot of documentation and bureaucracy in the whole carbon accounting process is just to prove that these things wouldn't have happened otherwise if not for some initiative. So if we are able to, and there are various protocols, including like the one you mentioned about green logistics specifically for industry, if we're able to use one of these internationally accepted protocols and prove on paper through third-party verification that these are additional carbon reductions, then that can be used towards mechanisms that we'll talk about later, but something called as clean development mechanism, verified emission reductions, whereby the cost of doing that would be covered by an organization, another organization. But Himani, please. Comment.
Sure. So I just want to add another dimension to it. So there's also, for example, a question on green logistics and the ratings that can be earned. So there are different aspects in the logistics chain where an intervention can be made, as Abhinav has talked about. So these interventions can, range from things like how optimized my route is when I'm trying to make the deliveries. What are the sort of driving techniques which lead to energy efficiency? How adequately and efficiently can I manage my payloads? Don't want to go half truck, don't want to come back empty. So empty mile reductions. Things can vary, and then if you are talking about warehouse or other such parts in the logistics chain, then we are already we start from everything that gets incorporated into the operations. What sort of lighting is there, whether it's LED, whether your inventorization process is smart, is IT based, what are your energy management systems in the facility, it's a cold storage or other kind of facility, what kind of thermostats, what kind of timers, what kind of gas heating or other water or other consumptions are. So it goes, what kind of forklifts are you using, are those electric forklifts and don't require any gas and oil. It ranges. So there are different kind of interventions that one can make over the whole value chain, depending on what kind of company or entity that we are talking about. Again, as Bhairavi said, there are smaller operators, there are smaller company groups. They are, at the end of the game, are also relying on different companies for these services. They are contributing that kind of connection. They are making that value chain happen for the client. So what are the choices that can be made there? How adequately those combinations can be made in terms of routing, in terms of filling up the payload, in terms of what is the different level of optimization. And all of these can be tracked if we have measured what is now. If I have measured adequately what is my current status, then with these interventions, I can still say that this is the difference that I have made as per my previous, as per my baseline. So what essentially we are sort of still highlighting here, and that is the presentation that we will like to say, is that the whole yarn on gases and other things are good to understand as the background, but we are focused on not everything from a GHG footprint. We are focused on certain gases, certain aspects. We are focused on certain type of things, especially related to the energy consumption. What happens within my building, within my vehicle, within my warehouse, within my shed is one step that I can directly measure, record, keep a track upon. And then the other level is, what is the different type of energies that I am using, how efficient those usage can be, what alternative fuels energy use, how I can minimize the usage. So that's the other part. And then of course the scope 3 that we will further discuss. But my larger question is, and there is a plethora of literature, one need not spend a single penny, at least I don't suggest to look for expensive environmental consultants and EHS experts and I don't know what not, and go to some fancy consultant and pay up a price. These are simple things that we can actively record in our own logbooks, and most of it will anyways be useful from tracking purposes, from other perspectives. What kind of services are we using? and options and things that we are offering to the clients, those also are being recorded. If I'm that company, I will rather go to a engineering college, get hold of economics, environmental, or some kind of graduating from a normal college, and bring that person in to look at those energy and other sort of consumption numbers, vehicle kilometers and other numbers. And there are simple calculations. This is not I mean, we can share that literature. We can actually we had tried to insert in a few slides with all those formulas and everything, but then we thought we don't have that much of time. There are simple formulas, simple numbers. There are established methodologies. They exactly define what unit, what number we are looking for, how you are calculating that energy. That energy needs to be measured in hours or minutes. All those details are available. We can share those details. It's a very simple process. It's a bit of effort that one needs to make. It's an initiative that one needs to make, and we really urge you all to make that effort, to make that initiative, and to start on that.
So Himani
And
and
then we
Abhinav,
can definitely
uh,
provide that.
Himani and Abhinav, I'm just sort of looking at the time clock. I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah.
And, so there are two quick things. And, Mr. Shinde has asked a question around green logistics. The reason we are asking these questions is because all these terms and larger frameworks do the round, and, one reads about it, right? But every supply chain, every movement, every truck operation can be either green or not green. And I think the idea of dividing scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, Mr. Shinde, is to say that if we can start initially with just scope 1, which is to say that what is in our control within our organizations, if we can start measuring it, have a system of recording it. And then, as there are other tools, and they will discuss them as we go along in the presentation,
Sure.
to use in terms of carbon credit, monetization, afforestation, and there are other options in which how you can turn your logistics more green by reducing emissions, by mitigating carbon, and also sort of monetizing carbon. The second ask, Himani, is from Mr. Bharkamkar, who's our president, which is that if we are asset light, so we rent a truck from someone, or we'll lease a ship, or we'll lease an aircraft, right? Is there a checklist that someone like you can help us come up with, that our procurement guys, when they take that cargo space, or when they lease that ship, or when they lease that truck, can have with sort of high emission intensive vendors? And so that's a ask. I'll let you respond to it separately, but I was just looking at the clock and I said 12:05. So if you want to get to the other part, because I think a lot of questions will get answered easily.
Sure. Yes, please.
So this is really, again, expanding on the point on scope 3. So and this is just about the process that needs to be followed. But since I've already defined it, I'm not going to spend too much time here. The next bit is, okay, so we've spoken about a methodology for GHG calculation, but how do you exactly measure how much is being emitted? So there's essentially two ways to go about it. One is to directly measure it using some sort of sensor, or if you're in industry that, this doesn't apply to everyone, but in industrial processes where the chemical reactions, you can use mass balance, stoichiometry to arrive at it. But typically direct measurements are not that common. It's usually done by way of estimation. And the main approach towards this is to use what are called emission factors. So there are databases maintained by international organizations as well as civil society organizations on, these are essentially conversion factors that tell you for every unit of fuel consumed, what is the amount of emission produced. So for every liter of petrol, every liter of diesel, what is the emission produced? And using these emission factors, and once you know what the activities are, so for a particular car manufacturing company, this could be about casting or conveyor belt related consumption. So there's electricity, there's also the combustion related energy consumption. Once you've identified the fuel, you only need to multiply it with the specific emission factor for that fuel. to understand what is the total emission. And typically, this would be done for a financial year. So over the course of the year, for activity A, what was the fuel consumed and what were the corresponding emissions. So this is like the main estimation that's being done. The science-based targets are, and Himani briefly touched upon this before, in case a company is going for voluntary emission reductions, right? Not necessarily adhering to any particular uh, methodology in terms of estimating emission reductions or particular reporting protocol, then something to fall back on is perhaps the science-based targets. In this case, they provide you with an estimate of the target reductions that you should go for so that the overall Paris Agreement targets are met. So these would be industry specific targets further broken down by firm level. And that gives you a guiding principle to say that I should aim for 30% versus aiming for 10% reduction. Another another mechanism we have is what is called the CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism. This is really to support developing countries with their emission reduction strategies. So for instance, there could be a company in Germany that is looking to contribute to reducing GHG emissions, but there's really not much they can do with respect to their own processes. Maybe the investment is too high, or maybe there's just no technology. Further GHG reductions are not possible. But the CDM creates an option for companies like this to be able to invest in a developing country in virtually any activity that can reduce emissions. So, for instance, they could invest in a company in India that could reduce its emissions by installing energy efficient boilers, for instance, right? A lot of CDM programs are also about afforestation. So the benefit here is that this is like a matchmaking exercise. So if the particular company in a developing country is not able to afford this advanced technology, they can tap into CDM to receive funds towards taking on the more advanced. So this could be, for instance, acquiring an electric fleet, for instance, right? That can cut down emissions for that operations of that particular company. Again, the key point here is to prove additionality. You have to show that in the absence of a CDM fund, you couldn't have acquired those boilers or those equipments that make your operations more efficient. So that the CDM protocol is essentially all about proving that additionality part of it. The other bit is also about voluntary or verified emission reductions. So CDM is a scenario where, say that particular company in Germany initiates the process looking for prospective investments into a developing country. But VER is kind of the opposite, where a company in, say, India has already done some emission reductions and they've got it certified. And now they can get investments from anybody who's seeking to reduce their emissions in a different country. So the only difference is that one is post facto, whereas the other is in preparation for something that's likely to happen. So this is a bit about the average price of carbon offsets that has been calculated based on these various CDM transactions. So which means that, and Himani, if you'd like to come in here just to walk them through the statement. Yeah.
So, often this is also a thing that, the efforts that we want to make in sustainability and environment, can they be monetized? And there was this whole CDM, carbon trading that was happening, like 7-8 years ago. And there were costs, per ton costs that rose up to $20, and then at one point they also reached a peak of $25 and more. And every month there was this
millions of CERs, certified emission reduction, has just talked about in between the developed country and the developing country. So over the years, there were issues with respect to rigorousness, with respect to verification, with respect to other aspects, and the whole Kyoto Protocol sort of in between didn't work that much, and it sort of gradually died off. But given the sort of conversations that are happening in international climate negotiations now, the changing trends and the changing experts advice is an idea to revive it in some form, in the not in the same format, but a bit with changes and a bit with more rigorous effort. But the idea that we are trying to put across here there are 91 methodologies for small scale and large scale emission reductions, which are very you have to see by in IPCC, in the CDM, and those are if you follow those, then you get CRs and then you can trade them. Right now, that process hasn't happened that much, but there are other sort of third party verified strong methodologies, some of which for example could be gold standard basically implies that these are rigorously verified, and there is authentication sort of attached with it, and that market is still surviving. These are the numbers from the March 2021, and you can clearly see that the average price is ranging from 14 USD per ton to up to $50 per ton of technology. So there are certain technologies which do attract this kind of a price, and they help in installation of such technologies that brings these savings. So just to a bit highlight here, some energy savings and other energy efficiency kind of techniques are directly useful to us. We want to deploy that. But some kind of waste recycling technology that I want to put in my in my company or at my site may be cost prohibitive, and for that I am looking for support, and this is the format in which the support can be generated. So these are the monetary supports that can be generated for our initiatives.
Thanks, Himani. So moving on to, we will talk a bit about some sector-specific schemes. But before that, what is the economy-wide intervention that can be made towards addressing the issue of carbon emissions? And the one that's been proposed and been adopted by various countries is what are called carbon markets. So essentially, in this case, the governing entity or the regulating entity sets a price for carbon and or sets a cap on the amount of carbon that can be generated, not a price. And the market essentially figures out the price for the carbon through various trading mechanisms. So just a very simplistic example here, which is that there could be, as I said, there could be a leader of a certain company for whom it's very straightforward to reduce their emissions, or for whom it's quite affordable to reduce emissions because of the nature of their process or work. And at the same time, at the other end of the spectrum, there could be another company for whom it's a very investment intensive, and so it's much more difficult for them to reduce emissions. What the carbon markets allow you to do is to trade any excess emissions reductions that have been produced by the first company to the second company. In that way, the overall goal of capping emissions and maintaining emissions is met, and the participants figure out for themselves who can reduce more and who can reduce less and so on. And they trade the excess as what are called carbon credits. So one carbon credit could be equivalent to 1 ton of carbon emissions reduced. And the price discovery happens through an exchange, which is in place. And again, there are more specific examples. But typically they cover all of them. They cover industry sector, a carbon market that's in place today. Most of them cover power sector because these are two of the most energy, most polluting industries across the world. Some of them also account for the transport sector and domestic aviation, and others also account for buildings, waste related and forestry related emissions. Now, it's important to note that the carbon market, the jurisdiction of the carbon market can be at pretty much any level. So you have EU ETS, which is the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which is at the Europe level, right? You can call it a region or a continent, whatever. But you also then have at a country level, such as Korea, New Zealand, but even at a state level. So Beijing has its own carbon market, and Switzerland, Tokyo are other examples. So the jurisdiction can vary. It's often easier to do it at a state or a subnational level, and much more tricky to do it at a national level. So this is, and in the recent years, we've seen many more carbon markets sort of come up. And once it is in place, it covers a spectrum of industries that need to comply with the emissions cap that is set. In India, these are the variety of various instruments that have been debated and discussed, and some of which have been implemented. On the tax side, for coal, we have an environmental cess already in place, and that is basically trying to price the negative impacts, environmental impacts of coal. So per ton of coal, there is a certain environmental levy that is issued. Uh, on the increasing the production of RE side, we have what are called a cap and trade mechanism called renewable purchase obligation, wherein the electricity utility has to purchase a certain amount of electricity from renewable sources every year. So, and that's like a mandate. And similarly, we have another regulatory mandate, which is the fuel efficiency standard for vehicles, which applies to both your LCVs as well as your cars and two-wheelers and so on. There are also then subsidy mechanisms in place to support the uptake of solar technology as well as electric vehicles, for instance. And we are also going to talk about the perform, achieve, and trade in detail. So this is one of the schemes that India mentioned in its commitment, or India has operationalized as part of its commitment to the Paris Agreement. The PAT scheme in its first cycle, and there have been 3 cycles, in its first cycle between 2013 and 15, included some of the most energy intensive industries in India, which includes textile, chemical and fertilizer manufacturing, steel manufacturing, and so on. So in total, there were about 478 organizations that fell under the purview of the Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, wherein these 470 industries collectively were required to cut down their emissions by about 6 MTOE, or million tons of oil equivalent. But as a result of the scheme, what was achieved was 8 MTOE. So they surpassed the target that they had set, or the government had set for this set of industries. And again, this is a market-based mechanism. So the same sort of mechanism is in place here, which is that certain industries who are well below the threshold that is set in terms of emission reduction can trade those excess reductions to another entity that does not manage to do it. So in this case, you see that scenario A can be considered as a company which has managed to reduce it below the threshold or the minimum that they were required. And then there is another company that has not managed to do it, but is able to purchase it from, say, company A. And still there is a bit that they have, that the target that they have not achieved and for which they pay a penalty. But it's better than paying penalty for the full emissions.
So,
Yeah.
just very quickly, Abhinav, in the interest of time, I will like to spend sort of like next 4-5 and quickly talk about the circular economy.
Sure. So In the circular economy process, the idea is to reduce not just the energy related impacts, but also the material and other non-renewable resource consumption related impacts. So here, one could be in any part of this value chain. For instance, it could be a user, a particular industry or company could be a user, and they need to essentially think about how can they prolong the use of their assets and how can they reuse and recycle it to the extent possible. But also then they need to sort of coordinate with their supplier to talk about the refurbishing and remanufacturing process, because it's not something that the entity is able to do by themselves. So for instance, if vehicles are being purchased for operations, can those vehicles be electric, or can those be vehicles that are likely to last longer, which can and electric vehicles essentially are a good example for this because they have very few moving parts. So about 20 moving parts as compared to 2000 in case of a internal combustion engine vehicle. So the gain from that is that these vehicles last longer. EVs, their powertrain lasts longer, and therefore it's a more sustainable or circular way of using a particular resource because it can be refurbished and used for much longer compared to an ICE vehicle. But Himani, in case you want to come in here with more comments.
No, actually, it will be good if we can talk about the relevant examples.
Yeah. Uh, so in terms of waste reduction, so for instance, it could be about changing processes so that the waste generation is reduced from a particular manufacturing process. In terms of, are there any other examples you'd like to add specifically?
No, actually, the examples that we have listed in the slides in the end,
Okay.
which are related to others.
I think it'd be really important, Abhinav and Himani, to go through examples of what you have seen that people like Musk and DHL and others are doing.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very important slide as well in terms of
Yeah.
examples. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So this is really like if you were to think at a scope 3 level for the logistics sector, these are the range of different things that can be done across the value chain. So one is, of course, the supply chain restructuring, standardized boxes that kind of bring in efficiencies in terms of transportation, use of 3D printing, dematerialization, but also what was mentioned earlier about mode shift, right? Moving from road to rail, that creates a certain emission reduction. But there's also other things like using clean and efficient technologies, perhaps at the warehouses, or even influencing the driving behavior, because there are efficiency gains to be had from influencing that as well. Changing the maintenance process, perhaps. And of course, then there is the whole changing the fuel, using biofuels or using EVs or hydrogen as part of your vehicle fleet. Load optimization, again, another part of the process that is perhaps under control of a logistics player, and warehouse management. So using digitization to track and optimize the movement of or utilization of fleets is another efficiency gain that can be had. So this is really an example from DHL, where they have reported their scope 3 emissions. And for a particular financial year. So they look at the purchased goods and services, the capital goods, the transportation services that they use, all the business travel that. So they are accounting for essentially all of the different heads under scope 3 and reporting it since 2014, and including the methodology that they've used. And they also then specify the kinds of activities that this includes under each heading. This is an example from Maersk, who have set certain targets. So they've said that they want to reduce 60% relative CO2 reduction from shipping. So specifically from their shipping activities. And they have plans of net zero vessels in operations, again by 2030, and net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So a lot of countries recently have come out with net zero targets. But this is an instance of an industry setting its own target to sort of align with the national targets of various countries. And of course, Maersk is an international player. They have footprint across the globe. So it becomes all the more important for them to sort of plan ahead for these things. And this is part of their strategy as to how they plan to do it. So this is like an evaluation of the different fuels that they could use and the advantages and disadvantages according to them. So they've considered biodiesel, methanol, lignin, as well as ammonia. Um, FedEx has it as part of their CSR strategy as well. So specifically on aircraft emissions and vehicle fuel efficiency and using alternative fuels is listed as part of their CSR strategy. And they disclose the progress that they've made as well as the exact amount of emissions that were reduced. Specifically, what in terms of what activities they've done is aircraft fleet modernization. With aircrafts, there's a significant gain with every iteration of the improvement in the technology or the engine technology that takes place that really reduces fuel consumption. So this is a commitment towards fleet modernization and using a specific technology called fuel sense that perhaps they have developed indigenously or in partnership with someone to improve fuel consumption. They've also committed to fuel efficiency in their driving and technology improvements as part of their road vehicle fleet. And intermodal rail transport is another part of their strategy. So they also list the total cost savings that they're likely to gain, as well as the emissions abated. We've also sort of compiled a set of tools that various companies can use for tracking their GHG emissions and doing that initial set of calculations to get us sense of the 80-20, right? Where do the hotspots lie? Where are the major emissions coming from? And so hopefully this resource will be useful to a few of the entities. So I would invite Himani for closing remarks here.
We will be glad to support in any which way. We are happy to share, some of the references that one can have or a checklist and things that one can have, especially the ones which are non-asset or asset light, operators. We don't have anything in the Indian context ready as of now, but what we will do is we will pull it up from the European context and try and make it as Indianized and relevant to the Indian context as we can, and share that with you. The other links that have already been shared by Abhinav, we will put them in a sort of a more organized sort of a two-pager that we can share. That will help companies to look in at the first go. But if Bhairavi, if you feel right, it is possible that we can take up a couple of case studies, with the member companies and help them do, at least the scope 1, 2, 3 sort of inventorization at the first level.
I thank you so much, first of all, Abhinav and Himani. I also want to just say that it's not that generally we are this quiet in this forum, but you do understand we're dealing with a very technical knowledge base that we're not used to. And so I would request, if that's all right with you, that you share a version of your presentation that Vasant and team can circulate with members, because there were some members who were having joining problems. So they couldn't link, the link was not working for them today. So that's why we also have some people who couldn't be here today. So one is, of course, there's a recorded session that will be circulated. But even if your presentation can, then people can spend some time applying their mind. My experience of doing this in our own companies has been that you have to start at home first. And sometimes you have to start with some very small things, including, basic things like, consumption of electricity in offices or lighting, or for that matter, just, how the cooling works, right? In the offices, is the cooling inventory that we're purchasing changes in terms of ACs? Is it certified by newer standards, or is it an old inventory that we're still using? That is, so it can be something as small as the kind of AC you use in your office. And that's my understanding, that it's very hard to go to a green supply chain and an overall carbon trading without really starting and understanding and playing with what you do in your own company first. I've done it in my homes, so you can see it in your homes, like you can see how you're buying power, how much you're spending, and that sort of gives you the comfort as an organization to use some of this more frequently before you even go to your vendor ecosystem.
Correct.
But one of the things that we are always sort of curious about, and maybe you could help us with, one is the checklist, as Mr. Bharkamkar talked about, but also something like what Mr. Shinde has shared, which is that some tool for us to calculate, not just kind of, not that we can do anything about it immediately, but if I am doing a logistic chain of a pickup from Dubai, delivery somewhere, right, using different modes, and doing a forwarding work, I should be able to calculate my carbon footprint, and at least internally start reporting the transactions we are doing and the carbon footprints that we are engaging in that. It may not be fully scientific, it may not be tradable, it may not be reportable, but if you could give us some basic tools, as Mr. Shinde shared the PDF, then we can start sort of saying, these are the transactions I do monthly, and this is my aggregate, carbon footprint, or this is my on an average carbon footprint for a supply chain. It helps us as an industry, but I think it also helps you guys as a research institute, because this data isn't there. So if we start capturing it, then you start having that data. So these are just some requests. I don't know if there are any questions. That is from Rusi. Yes, he said that the presentation should be shared. So if there are no more questions, I know we've run out of time. Vasant,
Yes.
back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Himani. Thank you, Abhinav. It was a great session, and you have sparing your valuable time and contributing so much of knowledge, which we will be circulating the presentation and the recording within our members. And we'll definitely come back to you, consolidated questions, which our members will get back to us. So we'll be in touch with you. Thank you, Bhairavi, for making this happen, getting all of them together, and it was a fantastic session. It was a very valuable knowledge, I think, which you have shared, and this is an ongoing thing. I think, after a couple of months, with some more development, some more new researches coming up, we will be in touch with you all. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And yes, as you rightly said, this is an ongoing thing, and we will like to continue to be engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.